The visit began on a quiet Friday afternoon, when Claire Bennett was folding laundry in her small Vermont house, the kind of house that held more memories than people, and she felt a strange sense of pause in the air even before the doorbell rang, as if something invisible had already arrived ahead of the guest. Claire lived alone, not because she disliked company, but because life had slowly shaped her into someone who valued peace after years of emotional storms. At 42, she had learned how to move through her days with calm routines, morning coffee by the window, afternoon work at her desk, evenings with books or soft music, and she told herself that this was enough. When the doorbell rang, she wiped her hands and walked to the door without hurry, already knowing it was her nephew Ethan Parker, though he had arrived earlier than planned. When she opened the door, Ethan stood there with a worn backpack, slightly unsure posture, and a smile that looked practiced rather than natural, and Claire noticed immediately how much he had changed since she last saw him, not just taller, but heavier in thought, like someone carrying questions he could not set down. He greeted her politely, calling her Aunt Claire the way he always had, but his eyes moved past her into the house, as if he were stepping into a place of safety, and Claire felt a quiet concern rise in her chest even, as she stepped aside and welcomed him in. The house smelled faintly of coffee and clean wood, and Ethan paused for a moment just inside, breathing out slowly, as if the simple act of arriving had taken effort. Claire offered him water, asked about the drive, made small talk that felt ordinary on the surface, yet underneath it all she sensed that this visit was not casual, not just a break from college, or a random weekend trip. Ethan had asked to stay for a few days with no clear reason, and Claire, trusting her instincts more than explanations, had said yes without pressing him. As they moved through the house, she noticed how carefully he placed his bag down, how his shoulders stayed tense, how he smiled at her bookshelf and framed photos, but didn't comment on them, and these small details told her more than words could. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the worn wood, and talked about harmless things, weather, traffic, the changing season, but the conversation felt like it was circling something unspoken, like a river moving around a hidden stone. Claire watched Ethan closely, seeing the way his fingers tapped lightly against his cup, the way his gaze drifted when silence stretched too long, and she recognized that restlessness, because she had once lived inside it herself. Years ago, she too had arrived at places hoping someone else would understand what she couldn't explain, and that memory softened her voice as she asked him if he was hungry, if he was tired, if college was treating him well. Ethan answered politely, carefully, but his words stayed on the surface, and Claire didn't push, because she knew that some truths only came out when they felt safe enough to land. Later, as they walked through the living room where the late afternoon light touched old photographs and books, Ethan paused briefly, looking around, as if the space itself mattered to him, and Claire felt a quiet realization that he hadn't come for advice alone, but for something steadier, something grounded. She showed him the guest room, simple and clean, and he thanked her with a sincerity that felt heavier than the gesture required, and when he closed the door to rest, Claire stood alone in the hallway, listening to the house settle, wondering what weight he had brought with him and why fate had chosen now to place it at her doorstep. She went back to the kitchen, made tea she didn't really want, and stood by the window watching the leaves fall, feeling a shift inside herself too, because Ethan's presence stirred something long quiet. A reminder that her calm life, though peaceful, had not erased her capacity to feel deeply. That evening, when Ethan joined her for dinner, the conversation flowed a little easier, laughter appearing briefly, but Claire noticed how often his eyes searched her face, as if he were measuring her reactions, and she understood then that this visit was not about escape, but about reflection. As night settled and the house grew quiet, Claire lay awake in her room thinking about how ordinary moments sometimes carry the start of great changes, how a simple knock on the door can open more than just a house, and she sensed, with a mix of curiosity and unease, that Ethan's visit would uncover truths neither of them had planned to face. The second day of Ethan's visit began early, before the sun had fully risen, when Claire heard quiet movement in the kitchen and found him sitting at the table with a mug he hadn't filled, staring out the window, as if the world outside held answers he was afraid to ask for, and she realized sleep had not come easily to him. She joined him without speaking at first, letting silence do what words often could not, and slowly the space between them softened as the morning light crept in. Ethan finally spoke about college, about lectures that felt heavy, about friends who seemed confident while he felt uncertain, and he spoke quickly, like someone afraid that stopping would make the courage disappear, and Claire listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, only nodding, because she knew that being heard mattered more than being guided. They spent the morning walking through town, passing familiar streets and quiet shops, and Ethan asked questions about her life there, about why she stayed, about whether she ever felt lonely, and Claire answered honestly but gently, telling him that loneliness and peace sometimes shared the same space, depending on how one chose to live with it. As they walked, Ethan shared pieces of his worry, not dramatic or loud, but steady and deep, about choosing the wrong path, disappointing people, waking up one day trapped in a life that didn't feel like his own, and Claire recognized the weight of those fears, because she had once carried them herself without knowing how to set them down. At lunch, they sat in a small cafe, and Ethan watched people pass by the window, couples laughing, strangers moving with purpose, and he said quietly that everyone looked like they knew where they were going, and Claire told him that certainty was often an illusion people learn to wear well. The afternoon moved quickly as they returned home, sorting old books, cleaning the garage, doing small tasks that allowed conversation to rise naturally, and Ethan spoke about his love for stories, how writing made him feel steady in a way nothing else did, but how he had been warned it was impractical, risky, something people only chased when they had nothing to lose. Claire didn't dismiss his fear, but she shared her own memory of standing at a similar edge years ago, choosing safety over passion, believing she was doing the responsible thing. And Ethan listened closely, absorbing every word as if it mattered deeply to him. As the day faded into evening, rain began to fall softly, turning the world outside grey and distant, and they sat in the living room with the lights low, the sound of rain filling the quiet spaces between their words. Ethan asked her if she ever wondered who she might have been if she had chosen differently, and the question settled heavily in the room, not painful, but honest, and Claire admitted that she did wonder, not with regret that burned, but with a quiet curiosity that never fully left. She explained that time had taught her that life rarely followed straight lines, and that meaning was often found not in perfect choices, but in understanding why choices were made. Ethan grew quiet then, his expression thoughtful, and Claire sensed that something inside him was shifting, slowly rearranging itself. Dinner was simple, but the conversation felt fuller, warmer, and for the first time Ethan laughed without restraint, the sound surprising both of them, and Claire felt a deep affection for him, not just as a nephew, but as a young man standing at the beginning of something uncertain yet important. Later that night, as the rain continued and the house settled into stillness, Ethan admitted that he had been afraid to talk to anyone about his doubts, because he didn't want to seem ungrateful or weak. And Claire told him that doubt was not failure, but a sign of caring deeply about one's future. She reminded him that many people moved forward without questioning, but those who paused to reflect often built lives that felt more honest, even if the path was harder. When Ethan finally went to bed, Claire remained awake, thinking about how his presence had stirred memories she rarely touched, how his questions echoed ones she had once buried, and she realized that this visit was not only shaping Ethan's understanding of himself, but reopening parts of her own heart she had carefully set aside. The day had passed quickly, filled with conversations that flowed easily yet carried weight, and as Claire stared at the ceiling in the quiet darkness, she understood that something important was approaching, something neither of them could fully name yet. And she sensed that the truth Ethan carried was getting closer to the surface, ready to be spoken, ready to change the direction of more than one life. The third day unfolded with a quiet intensity, as if the house itself understood that something important was ready to surface, and it began when Ethan wandered into the living room while Claire was busy outside, his attention drawn to a shelf he had noticed before, but not explored, where old books and framed memories rested side by side like paused moments in time. As he ran his fingers along the spines, one thin photograph slipped free from a book and fell to the floor, and when he picked it up, he saw a younger Claire standing beside a man whose relaxed smile carried warmth and hope, and the image held him still longer than he expected. When Claire returned and noticed the photo in his hand, she stopped walking, her breath catching slightly, not from pain, but from surprise, because that memory rarely came out into the open. Ethan asked who the man was, his voice careful and respectful, and Claire took a moment before answering, then sat across from him and said his name was Daniel, someone she had loved deeply when life felt wide and full of promise. She spoke without drama, but every word carried weight as she explained how they had met, how their dreams had once aligned, and how circumstances, fear, and timing slowly pulled them apart despite the love still being real. She described choosing stability over uncertainty, believing it was the right decision, and how that choice shaped the quiet life she lived now, not unhappy, but missing something unnamed. Ethan listened closely, not interrupting, his expression serious, as if her story was filling in pieces of his own confusion, and when she finished, the room felt still, heavy with shared understanding. He admitted then that he was scared of standing at the same crossroad, of choosing what others expected instead of what felt true to him, and his voice carried a vulnerability that surprised Claire, because it revealed how deeply he trusted her. They talked for hours after that, not dwelling on the past but unpacking what it meant to live with choices, how some paths closed gently while others stayed open longer than expected, and Claire told him that regret was not always loud or painful, but often quiet and patient, waiting years to be acknowledged. The afternoon moved quickly as they took a drive through the countryside, the conversation continuing without effort, Ethan asking thoughtful questions about love, purpose, and whether it was possible to start again later in life, and Claire answered honestly, saying that while time changed people, it did not erase the heart's ability to hope. When they returned home, the sky had softened into evening colors, and Ethan seemed lighter yet more focused, like someone who had finally named the fear he had been carrying. Over dinner, he confessed that he had been hiding his true interests, pretending to fit into a plan that didn't feel like his own, and Claire told him that courage didn't always look bold, sometimes it looked like quiet honesty with oneself. As night settled in, they sat in the living room again, the photograph now placed gently on the table between them, no longer hidden, and Claire realized that sharing her story had shifted something inside her too, reopening a part of her heart she had carefully protected. Ethan thanked her for trusting him with something so personal, and she smiled, realizing that trust moved in both directions, growing stronger through shared truth. Before heading to bed, Ethan paused and said that hearing her story made him realize he didn't want to live wondering what might have been, and those words stayed with Claire long after the lights were turned off. Lying awake, she thought about how unexpected moments often carried the greatest meaning, how a simple photograph had opened a door to reflection for both of them, and she sensed that the final piece of Ethan's reason for coming was close to being revealed, not dramatic or sudden, but steady and honest, and she knew that when it came, it would change the quiet balance of her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The final morning arrived with clear light and a sense of calm purpose. And Claire sensed it the moment she woke, as if the house had settled after days of holding its breath, and when she entered the kitchen she found Ethan already dressed, his bag by the door, his posture steady in a way she had not seen before. They shared breakfast quietly, not because there was nothing to say, but because the important words were waiting for the right moment, and when Ethan finally spoke, his voice was calm and sure as he told her that he had made a decision during the night, one that had been forming through every walk, every conversation, every shared silence. He explained that he planned to change his major and follow his interest in writing, not out of rebellion or impulse, but because he finally understood that fear should not be the main guide in choosing a life, and Claire listened with focused attention, hearing not doubt, but clarity in his words. He admitted that he had come to her because he trusted her honesty, because he needed to see what living with unspoken regret looked like before deciding his own future, and Claire felt a deep mix of emotion, not guilt, but responsibility, realizing that her life had quietly taught him something meaningful. She told him she was proud of him, not for choosing a specific path, but for choosing awareness and courage, and she reminded him that no decision guaranteed ease, but living truthfully often brought peace even during struggle. Ethan smiled then, a real smile, free of tension, and thanked her for giving him space instead of answers, for listening instead of directing, and for showing him that growth did not always require dramatic change, sometimes only honest reflection. As he prepared to leave, They stood at the doorway for a moment longer than expected, sharing a quiet understanding that this visit had changed them both, and when Ethan hugged her, it was not rushed or awkward, but steady and grateful, carrying the weight of closure and beginning at once. After his car disappeared down the road, Claire returned to the silent house, feeling the absence, but not the emptiness, because something within her had been gently stirred awake. She moved through the rooms slowly, noticing how different everything felt, as if light reached deeper corners than before, and when she came across the photograph of Daniel still resting on the table, she did not put it away as she once would have. Instead, she sat down and allowed herself to remember without sadness, realizing that time had softened the edges of her past and left behind understanding rather than pain. She recognized that while she could not rewrite her choices, she could acknowledge their meaning and allow herself to grow beyond them, and for the first time in years, the thought of reconnecting with her own unfinished story did not feel frightening. That afternoon, Claire opened her laptop and began to write, not a letter filled with expectation, but a simple message, honest and respectful, reaching out to Daniel to ask how life had treated him, understanding that whatever response came, the act itself mattered more than the outcome. As evening settled, Claire felt a sense of quiet fulfillment, knowing that Ethan's visit had not been a disruption, but a reminder that life continued to offer chances for reflection and renewal at any age. She realized that revelation did not always arrive as sudden change, but often as clear understanding, and that both she and Ethan had stepped forward in their own ways, guided not by fear or regret, but by honesty and hope. And as she closed her laptop and looked out into the fading light, Claire felt ready to meet whatever came next with an open heart.